Hi there, welcome to episode 263 of The Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Eidson, and if you're in the Northern Hemisphere like me, I hope that you're having a wonderful summer so far. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, just know that spring is on its way soon. And so over the last few weeks, I have been busy recording new interviews to share with you. So throughout August, I'm going to be publishing conversations with Dana Small, who goes by Miss Category Management. She's also a strategic sourcing manager at Biomarin, with Hélène Lafite of Consulting Quest, where we deep dive into best practices and market trends for the consulting category, and Jason Camerata of MDC Partners, who shares MDC's procurement transformation journey. So those are all to come over the next few weeks. Now, readers of our This Week in Procurement newsletter will know that I facilitated a webinar last week with Efficio, and it was titled Driving Greater Procurement Performance from Complex Direct Spend and Factory Indirects. Now, Efficio are the largest procurement pure play consulting firm in the world. They're headquartered in the UK. They have offices around the world. And in this webinar, I was joined by two of their US-based principal consultants, Arthur Mattouch and Waldo Saville. Now, this was a really interesting webinar. Arthur and Waldo shared a number of strategies that they have successfully employed to reduce the cost of complex direct and, factory indirect spend categories. So what I thought I'd do today is actually share the audio from one of the case studies that we discussed during the webinar. And I'll leave the details to Waldo to frame up the case study in a little bit more details. But it was a company and it was a manufacturing company, as you would imagine, with it being direct and factory indirects. They were looking to quickly reduce costs through a coordinated cost reduction program, while minimizing disruption on the business. That was really important. So as you'll hear, they only ended up switching suppliers for about 12% of the total number of components, products, services that were run through this program. So if you have responsibility for direct spend or for indirect products and services that support the factory floor, I'm sure that you're going to be inspired by some of the strategies that they employed. Now, to watch the entire webinar, you can do so by going to artofprocurement.com/direct webinar. That's all one word. Or you can find the link at our show notes page for today, which is artofprocurement.com/episode 263. That's artofprocurement.com/episode 263. So with all that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Waldo to share all the details about the case study and to go into a little bit more details of the strategies and the tactics that they employed to really help this company reduce their factory indirect spend and their complex direct material spend.
This is an example of, a typical manufacturing, mid-cap manufacturing company that we work with. In this particular one, there were 25 factories, mostly in North America, some in Europe, one in China. And, just reiterating some of what Arthur said, very decentralized. This particular one had grown through acquisition. So, they bought complementary companies, but obviously if you continue to buy different companies, they come with different systems, different habits, different supplier relationships, etc. Heavily engineering-led, heavily GM-led. Right, so 25 individual GMs kind of running their own kingdom. And, with that, a lot of long-standing supplier relationships and tribal knowledge. And frankly, we often don't see a focus on strategic sourcing. It's usually very reactive. Hundreds of POs often we'll see for the same part raised in a year. And part of the issue is the fundamental lack of data that we see. Especially when we're pulling through distribution and where, we often don't know our manufacturer part numbers, and just the scale of data makes it very hard for us to have a company-wide view in a holistic way of seeing everything in the same way. So going to the slide, many of these categories we continually do. Machine parts is a big one, electrical components, labels, fabrications, and then some logistics as well. In this particular case, machine parts, as you can see, we're around 37 million on an annual basis. We ended up addressing 23.5 million of that. You do not have to address all the spend. You need to be pragmatic. This is a very intensive exercise And, we ended up addressing 24 million of that because what we did was address the core suppliers. Okay. And then obviously, once you go past the core suppliers, you have a very, very large tail. And with that becomes a very heavily fragmented, unfavorable product mix in that very, very long tail. So that's not something you want to address first. You want to address the core suppliers, and you want to address all the parts within those core suppliers. As you know, you don't want to be in a situation where, let's say you want to actually move away from one supplier to another, that you've taken away all the favorable product mix and that supplier no longer wants to produce the other stuff, right? So you address all the parts of those, or all the recurring parts anyway of the core suppliers. Electrical components, again, different strategies by brand across all the different divisions. Some going through different channels, some going by the OEM, some going through distribution. Many of the OEMs often had different contacts at each of the different factories, but a huge amount of different families of electrical components, from enclosures to sensors to human machine interfaces, lots of different areas to address. Labels, this was, I think, probably more of a niche area, but this was one where they had worked with the same incumbent for 15 years, and we were facing inflationary pressure from general market increases due to some supplier dynamics. And this is something that I'll go into more detail in, but basically this is $20 million of paper. And then, fabs, very similar to machine parts, heavily localized. Often we would see that the sort of the buyer planner will go to the supplier that he knows will make, or her knows that it will make it in the lead time needed. And what that means is there's not enough time to actually understand what are my supplier capabilities. Maybe that supplier requires 2 machines and 3 operations to do something that another supplier can do in 1 machine and 1 operation. And as I go through these slides, I'll explain in the approach how we start to focus in those areas. That's where we drive value. I think we can go to the next slide. So, one size does not fit all. We had different, this is almost the outcome of the awards. So, for machine parts and for fabricated parts, what we did was we focused within the incumbent of a given division, right? Even though one division may work with one supplier, another division that probably has never spoken to anyone in that other one because they're so decentralized, even working with that same incumbent of that other division, for them, it's almost a new supplier, right? So there's a lot of pressure in machine parts and fabricated parts, especially due to testing requirements and, first article inspections and PPAPs, depending on, the level of testing required, to really leverage the incumbents as much as possible. So for those, we really focused on working within a given division within the incumbent. So we were aligning the spend to the suppliers based on their wheelhouse, right? Maybe a supplier is better at turning of medium tolerance parts versus, a turning/milling operation, etc. Okay, so divisional incumbent focus for those. For pneumatics, I call it MRO parts, but that's basically fittings, fasteners, and hardware. And for labels, there was no reason that we couldn't go to a single dominant OEM. And that, gave us a huge amount of benefit, especially when these OEMs had never seen this company-wide aggregated demand before. They'd only ever seen discrete pockets and orders. So we were able to leverage, a major OEM company-wide. And then for some areas like electrical components, belts, pulleys, conveyors, we actually wanted to break it down by category. So, for electrical enclosures, for example, we wouldn't want to necessarily have to put that with, say, sensors, because we know in the market you have different players that are preferred for different families. And then finally, we did some single service providers around the inbound and outbound freight, parcel, car hire. We were able to do that. So different approaches for different categories. The most important thing is having the stakeholder involvement in the process. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Hey, Waldo, can I just ask one question?
And
Sure. we can use this slide as well. We don't need to go back on the slide. I wanted to ask this now rather than waiting to the end, just because I think it's relevant to a specific line item that you have on there. And the question came in that, looking at this case study, you have 6.1 million for 3PLs, LTL and FTL. The question was, how do you actually get really good quality data on freight and logistics spends? Is the only way to get that from the 3PL, or are you digging into other systems that, within your client where that data resides and kind of pulling it out, extracting it?
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, we were able to get, again, getting that route information and getting all the breakdown and the data that's needed is quite difficult. Especially when a lot will just be, local carriers. And, we were able to sort of get a basket of data, and then we were able to get different 3PLs to come in and then start quoting on that and actually doing some work to sort of build it out. Arthur's also, has a lot of experience with working with freight. What's your experience, Arthur?
Yeah, sometimes, Phil, we go and reconstruct it. I just worked for a chemical company, a medium player in the market, and they didn't have a 3PL. So they had a proliferation of local suppliers around it that necessarily couldn't cough up beyond invoicing. So the clear thing then to do is to prioritize. So we decided not to go all in. We decided to pick the large 50 routes and spend a month with a couple of analysts to build a really detailed picture with different snippets of information that we required. Most of it, though, coming from the supplier, because they will keep a track of a particular route. But that paid off really well, because again, we drove 30% savings out of that route by just having information and making a fair comparison across the board between individual suppliers, but more importantly to optimize the loads, because this was a tanker contract, and half of the tankers were going empty back to HQ. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's a trade-off. That's what Waldo mentioned before. You can't simply go with a playbook, and we did spend a month working with two analysts on it.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Okay. I think the hardest thing really around this program was, how do we actually get buy-in, right? We need to, when I go into savings tracking, we'll talk a bit about, holding ourselves accountable to the business. But, this was a very, very successful program. Because we really prioritized, take, for example, machine parts, right? We had a huge number of suppliers with, thousands of items. And, the way we ran the process is, obviously, we bucketed them into different lots by the process, the size, the tolerance, the material. And that was able to allow suppliers to focus on the areas that they thought they would be best suited at. And then as we started to drill down and have these meetings with these suppliers, which were very collaborative clarification meetings, we were able to use our evaluation tools to actually see, where that supply should now go and focus. Because there's nothing more disheartening for a supplier who's having to go through an individual print, which might take them 15 minutes to 30 minutes to print, and they've got 8,000 possible options for them to look at, right? So, again, these programs are successful because we're not banging our fists on the table and asking for low rates. We're not doing that. We are trying to actually help suppliers who might have capabilities that we're not aware of and focus their efforts in that process. So, I always like to have less time between rounds and more rounds, right? So it's more iterative, it's more clarification. Looking at some of these numbers, we actually did this at a time when raw material prices were going up 25%. So that's where the cost mitigation comes in. But obviously, looking at financial savings last year to next year, right? If you were looking at pure procurement savings, then we bucket the two together. But we only moved 12% of items, so we were able to do that. Get 1.7 plus 1.1 million just through moving around 10% of the items. And you will always face pushback. You'll feel like you're pushing rope because your engineers are going to be focusing on product innovation and creating new products, right? And the last thing they want to do is to have to qualify and test a new item for, say, $3,000 in value. The thing is when you add them all up, it's a lot of money, right? So you might have some that are $5,000 of savings, some that might be $15,000 of savings. But, you know, if you look at them discretely, it feels like it's not that much. So really getting that buy-in to actually commit to a program of testing to support this is important. But yes, we were successful because we didn't change the world, and we were really aligning with existing incumbents. So we didn't really have to create too many new relationships. We brought in 1 or 2 new suppliers, but that was very, very minimal. And then we actually worked with the divisions to get them to build a transition plan, right? So let's say a division had 50 parts that they had to test and qualify. We would discuss what is the testing requirement, what is the regime, when shall we start to do those, and let's do them as a family of parts, right? And that way we were able to hold them accountable to actually deliver those savings, besides obviously giving them targets in their budgets.
I just have a question as well, Waldo. So, you know, when you're looking at actually changing suppliers, you know, changing from the incumbent, and you said one of the things you try and do is really minimize that as much as you possibly can. You know, what's the thinking in terms of, you know, what's the threshold when it really makes sense? I'm imagining it's not just, well, they're a cent cheaper and so we're going to move, because there's all this cost of change. You know, how do you really factor in the cost of change when determining the best business decision is actually to move away from the incumbent supplier to a new provider?
Yeah, I mean, let's exclude the fact that you might be unhappy with a supplier, or they're not fulfilling lead time, or they don't have the capacity. Let's just look purely at, we're doing a competitive, you know, situation. It really depends. It depends on the products you're making. You know, I've done castings many times, and it really depends on the complexity, right? Obviously, you have a pattern, you have the casting. You know, it might take 6 months to 9 months of testing, right? Mm-hmm. That's a lot of risk in your supply chain. So, you know, you're not going to want to qualify and move something like that unless the benefit must outweigh the pain, right? So typically, I think, especially if you have a very customized engineered to order business, or an element of the spend is very engineered to order as opposed to configured to order, you don't want to be moving more than, say, 15% of items, right? Because if you try and do that over an unrealistic time frame, you just will not have the commitment from the engineering department to actually do that. And it will just fall down. Yeah. So 10 to 15% is my typical rule of thumb.
Hi there, it's Phil, just jumping in here again. So we had a really engaged audience through the webinar, and we did receive a number of questions. So I'm going to share a couple of the questions right here that came in during the course of the conversation.
The first one is, do the new contracts that you put in place, you know, as you went through the process of identifying cost savings opportunities, you know, recontracting with a lot of suppliers, including the incumbents, did you include year-over-year savings, you know, over a long-term agreement, or was it really just a one-off capture of cost savings?
I think for some categories, we may look for efficiencies. You know, typically many of these contracts will be 3 years, and you know, we'll have some sort of rebate structures in place if it comes to, say, standard components or some of our distributors. We try and minimize rebates, but often, you know, you need to have them. Yeah. So again, it depends. If it's a partnership which is really based on, let's say, for example, in machine parts, an area of your spend is some very specific assemblies, and you know that over time that supplier is going to get more efficient at doing that, then maybe you want to have some targeted year-on-year efficiencies that, you know, there's a gain share mechanism, if you like. Sometimes we do that, yes. Yeah.
And the second question, kind of on the theme of savings, was when you have pretty mature categories, you know, they've been addressed a number of times. There's not necessarily a strategy that's going to take another 10 or 15% out of a category. You know, do you take a look at kind of benchmarking and thinking we should be saving 1, 2, 3% still in year-over-year savings, or, you know, do you take another approach to those categories when you look at what the opportunities may be?
Yeah. So, you know, I think if you're at the point where you've tensioned every single area of spend, I think you've done a great job. But I mean, listen, I've not seen, you know, I've seen some categories that have been tensioned well, but I always see the classic, okay, they've never really leveraged all of the volume across the company before and broken it down into the same area. So what I would say is, yes, sometimes for areas of spend which we've tensioned and are large, and maybe you've got you've got a couple of very major incumbents that you work with, then yes, you can look at things like, TCO elements, right? How can I help you make it drive more value for me, right? And then you end up in a collaborative engagement with that supplier. And that can add a lot of value. We did it on filters, right? Where we changed the medium of the filter. We were able to work with the supplier to change the medium of the filter and where they got their material for. Mm-hmm. So yes, but I think there should be a balance in an organization. You should keep tensioning the market every couple of years. And there should be certainly an element of supplier collaboration in there as well.
And it's Phil back here once again. I want to thank you so much for tuning into today's show. So to see the slides that Waldo referred to throughout the case study, and to listen to a couple of other case studies that we shared in the webinar, you can go to artofprocurement.com/direct webinar, or click on the link on today's show notes page at artofprocurement.com/episode 263. That's going to direct you to a sign-in page to be able to view a recording of the entire webinar. So I hope you enjoyed today's show, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the week, and I'm looking forward to being back next week with an interview with Dana Small. So until then, take care. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.